The village was still smouldering, the smell of charred wood and flesh carried on the damp morning air. The flames had burned low, leaving only the red glow of embers among the collapsed roofs. No screams now, no shouts of terror, just silence, heavy and unsettling. For the Norse warriors who stood on the blackened soil, this silence was not victory. It was a warning. They had come expecting tribute, an easy raid on a scattered people said to live in huts and shrines, with no kings to lead them and no walls to defend them. The jarls who planned the expedition promised silver and slaves, a few weeks' work for glory and plunder. 30 hardened men followed the longship inland, their shields scarred from battles in Northumbria, their axes wet with blood from the Vistula coast. They whispered prayers to Thor as they marched, not from fear of men, but from the feeling that the land itself was watching them. The trail wound into the forest, where ancient trees closed over the path. The morning sun dimmed, swallowed by the canopy. Mist gathered between the trunks, coiling like pale serpents, hiding roots and stones underfoot. Their boots squelched in damp soil. Male lynx clinked softly with each step. No birds called from the branches. No deer moved in the underbrush. A hunter's silence, yet nothing stirred. The stillness of the place pressed on them like a weight. A sound broke it at last, a long, low howl, drawn out and mournful, neither fully wolf nor human. It came from ahead, echoing off the trees. The warriors froze, looking to their leader. He raised a hand for silence. Then another howl rose behind them, closer this time, a rougher note that made the hairs on the back of their necks bristle. The men shifted uneasily, shields rattling. These were not wolves they knew. One warrior to the right gave a startled cry. The ground collapsed beneath him, snapping like a broken jaw. His body vanished with a crash of brush and wood. A moment later came the crunch of sharpened stakes, the scream of a man skewered through. The others shouted, rushing toward the pit, but before they could even look inside, the forest itself came alive. Figures emerged from the mist, tall men with faces painted in spirals of white and red. Their eyes burned through the paint, steady and merciless. Bones and feathers hung from their hair, some cloaked in the full skins of wolves, the animals' heads pulled down like masks over their own. They moved in silence, slipping from behind trees too thin to hide them. A single horn blasted, deep as thunder, and the sky darkened with arrows. They fell not in clumsy volleys, but in precise waves, each shaft finding a gap in shield or armor. Men fell crying out, some still burning where the arrowheads carried pitch and flame. The Norse tried to raise a shield wall, but the attack came from every side at once. The forest itself seemed to spit enemies from its shadows. Through the smoke and panic strode one who towered above the rest. His face was hidden behind a mask carved of wood, smooth and terrible, with eyes too large and mouth stretched wide. Painted lines shifted in the filtered light as if alive. He held a spear whose blade curled like a serrated thong. In his other hand, a cord strained with the weight of a great wolf, yellow eyes locked on the nearest throat. The Norse shouted to steady their line, but already men were falling, their formation shattered. Whistles cut through the air, sharp and quick, and from the underbrush more wolves bounded, lean and hungry, their handlers driving them toward the flanks. Horses would have panicked at the scent alone. Men staggered under the weight of terror. The wolves lunged, snarling, driving the warriors where their masters wanted them, straight into traps where more painted men waited with axes and clubs. A shield cracked like kindling under a stone-headed weapon. A Viking stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief as the masked leader stepped forward, spear leveled. He spoke in a tongue harsh and grinding, alien as the forest around them. The words needed no translation. You do not belong here. You never will. One by one the invaders broke. Some tried to run but were cut down by arrows in the back, their bodies dragged into the mist. Others fought desperately, striking down foes, only to find two more rising to replace the fallen. The cries of the dying blended with the growls of wolves and the hollow beat of drums hidden deeper in the forest. The sound was not just battle. It was ritual. The leader raised his spear to the sky, and the painted warriors howled like their wolves, a chorus of human and beast, a sound so raw that even the bravest felt their blood chill. Fire caught on cloaks and beards. Men staggered into the mud, writhing, clawing at their burning mail. The forest swallowed them whole, their last screams drowned in smoke and mist. For those who fell, there would be no tales carried home across the sea, no songs of glory sung in smoky halls. The longship by the shore would wait in vain for its crew, creaking softly as it rocked in the tide. The raiders had come for easy prey, for silver and slaves. What they found was vengeance, a people who knew their land like a second skin, who fought not for plunder but for survival, and who wielded terror itself as a weapon. This was no chance skirmish. It was a lesson written in blood, a message carried on the howls of wolves and the silence of the forest. The Wends were no prey. They were the nightmare waiting at the edge of the Viking world. They lived between rivers and forests, on the low coasts where the Baltic broke into shallow bays and islands, in the swamps and meadows where fog clung low to the earth. To the Vikings they were simply the Wends, a word spoken with a mix of scorn and unease. To themselves they were many tribes, each with its own name, its own gods, its own chiefs, yet bound by tongue and blood. They were Slavs of the West, spread across the lands from the Elbe to the Oder, and though no single king ruled them, they shared a way of life strong enough to keep them alive where others would have been swallowed. The Norse told stories of them as shadow people, wild and untamed, the sort who painted their faces and hid in marshes. Saxon monks called them pagans, obstinate and cruel, people who clung to their idols when the cross was offered. Both outsiders agreed on one thing: they were hard to conquer. Their world was not open farmland dotted with villages and roads. It was a broken maze of rivers, lakes, and woods, each turn defended, each waterway a highway only they knew. Their settlements were not weak huts waiting for fire, but wooden strongholds built on islands or raised earth, walls of oak trunks sharpened and locked together, ringed by ditches that filled with water after rain. The Norse had their longships, but the Wends had their grody, circular fortresses that rose from the swamps like crowns of wood. Inside those walls lived not scattered bands, but whole communities. Farmers, smiths, hunters, traders, priests, children, each fortress was a small world. Smoke from hearths curled into the sky, mingling with the scent of pine and wet soil. They raised cattle and pigs, grew barley and rye, tended orchards, and hunted the wild boar that rooted in the woods. Their women worked the looms, wove linen dyed with plant colors, and shaped clay into vessels painted with swirls. From iron they forged axes, spears, and plowshares, always balancing war and life. They spoke a tongue that carried the rhythm of water and wind, harsh to Norse ears, closer to song than command. It tied them together even as tribes argued and quarreled. The Obertrites guarded the western frontier near the Elbe, always pressed by Saxon knights. The Veliti held the marshes of the north, fierce and stubborn. The Roni ruled the island of Rügen, where the temple of Svantevit stood tall above the sea. Further south, the Sorbs kept the valleys of Lusatia, a stubborn root that survives even now. Each tribe had its chieftains, chosen not by birth alone but by strength, wisdom, and the backing of warriors. Councils were held in the open, in groves or before the gates, where elders, priests, and fighters argued until a decision was made. To outsiders it looked like chaos, yet it worked. No single defeat could end them, for no king carried the whole people on his shoulders. If one tribe fell, another rose to fight. If one fortress burned, another was rebuilt deeper in the woods. This lack of unity was also their weakness, for it left them vulnerable to stronger neighbors with singular crowns and armies that marched under one banner. But for centuries it kept them alive, a swarm that could never be crushed all at once. To the Vikings, used to breaking villages like dry sticks, the Wends were maddening. They struck when least expected, vanished into swamps, then returned in greater number. They fought with fury, but not like berserkers. Their rage was tethered to the earth itself. They fought because every tree was theirs, every stream fed their cattle, every mound held their dead. The forest was more than shelter. It was their skin. Outsiders could never fully enter it without becoming prey. The Saxons who came from the west wrote of them with bitter respect. Missionaries sent to baptize them often returned in chains or not at all. Soldiers sent to build churches watched them torn down by night. The chronicles called the Wends idol worshippers, stubborn in their refusal to bow to Christ. But beneath the scorn, fear bled through. They feared the way these tribes clung to their gods with the same strength they clung to their soil. They feared the way their shrines were guarded not by walls, but by entire communities willing to kill for the sanctity of their groves. Trade, too, tied them to the wider world. From the east they drew silver from Kiev and beyond. From the north came amber, furs, honey, and wax. From the south came tools, weapons, and even fine wine. Their harbors swelled with ships, not only Viking but Slav, Saxon, and Dane. Some settlements grew rich, their markets thick with coin, beads, and silks. At Volyn, travelers from Arabia, Byzantium, and the Frankish lands mingled in the streets. Yet the wealth did not soften them. Prosperity only gave them better arms to hold back their enemies. When the Norse wrote of them, they spoke of a people both familiar and strange. Familiar, because their ships sailed the same waters, their axes cut the same wood, their hands built strongholds from the same timber. Strange, because the Wends refused to be shaped into the roles others demanded. They were neither conquered people nor distant barbarians. They were neighbors who could trade one day and burn your halls the next. Who were the Wends? They were a puzzle to every kingdom that faced them, a people of many faces who never vanished, never bowed completely, never fit into the neat lines of empire. They were the thorn in the side of the Saxon dukes, the shadow that haunted Viking sailors, the flame that kept flaring in the forests long after others thought it had been extinguished. To call them one nation is to miss their essence. They were many, but together they were one force, difficult to destroy, impossible to forget. And so the Norse who crossed the sea came to know their name, not as a rumor or a whisper, but as an answer written in blood and iron, rising from the woods with painted faces and wolfskin cloaks. They were the Wends, and their story was just beginning. They rose out of the marshes like wooden crowns, their shapes circular and deliberate, each log set with the patience of generations. To the Vikings they were an irritation, to the Saxons an obstacle, but to the Wends themselves they were lifeblood. These were the Grodi, the strongholds that marked the land not with palaces or cathedrals, but with the simple certainty of survival. To step inside one was to feel the weight of centuries of struggle pressed into timber and clay. They were more than forts. They were the beating heart of a people who knew they were surrounded by enemies stronger in number, richer in silver, and hungrier for land. A grod began as a ring. Men cut the forest itself into walls, felling oaks older than memory, sharpening their trunks into spears, then binding them together side by side. Behind this palisade they piled earth and clay, raising it until the wall stood as tall as two men, sometimes more. Ditches were dug before it, not shallow trenches but deep cuts in the ground, left to fill with water from the rivers that wound through the land. In times of war those ditches turned to moats, black and uninviting, making every approach slow and dangerous. In times of peace they kept the pigs and cattle from wandering too far. The entrances were narrow gates, often bent into angles so that no straight charge could break through. To storm such a place was not impossible, but it demanded time, blood, and a willingness to face arrows raining down from above. Inside the ring, life moved as it always had. Houses of timber and clay leaned together, their thatched roofs rising with the smoke of hearths. Narrow lanes wound between them, never straight, always turning like the rivers outside. Wells were dug, granaries built on stilts to keep the rats out, workshops where smiths beat iron and carpenters shaped planks. In the center often stood a hall, larger than the rest, where the chieftain lived and decisions were made. At times there was a shrine as well, a place of carved idols, horns of mead poured to the gods, the air thick with the smoke of burning herbs. Every part of the grad had its place, every life within it bound to the others. These fortresses were not monuments for display. They were functional, living, breathing things, designed for a people who never expected lasting peace. Enemies came from every direction, Northmen in ships, Saxons on horseback, Poles from the east. Each enemy burned villages and fields, but the Grodi endured. They could not be easily bypassed, for to leave one standing was to invite raids in return. They could not be easily captured, for every warrior inside fought as though the ground beneath his feet was sacred. A grad was more than a fortress. It was a promise that the Wends would not vanish. When strangers approached these walls, they saw a crude construction, logs and mud thrown together by half-savages. But once they tried to break them, they learned differently. The walls did not fall to the first strike of a ram. The gates did not open with a single push. Fire arrows might catch the thatch, but the people inside knew how to smother flames, how to rebuild, how to fight through the smoke. Even when a grad was taken, it was never for long. The survivors would retreat into the woods, melt into the swamps, and when the conquerors moved on, they would return to raise it again, stronger than before. Travelers who passed through Wendish lands remembered them vividly. Some compared them to the hill forts of the Celts, others to the wooden bars of the Saxons, but none carried quite the same spirit. The Grodi were always round, always enclosed, always filled with people who lived not just beside their walls but within them. In times of famine, grain from the fields outside was stored in the safety of the circle. In times of war, whole villages crowded in, turning a settlement of hundreds into a refuge for thousands. The walls groaned under the weight of bodies, but they held. Children grew up playing in the shadow of those palisades, learning early that survival depended on vigilance. To the Vikings, used to raiding open coasts and undefended farms, the Grodi were a nightmare. Longships could glide into harbors, but once the crews pushed inland, they found themselves staring at wooden rings bristling with spears. They could not burn them as they burned churches in England, for the people inside fought like wolves cornered in their den. Siege engines were rare in the north, and few raiders carried them across the sea. Without them, the walls were nearly impossible to breach before reinforcements arrived from other tribes. The Grodi were not simply defensive walls, but centers of culture. Songs were sung in their halls, marriages celebrated, disputes settled. Markets flourished in the open spaces, where traders brought salt, iron, amber, and furs. Priests led rituals under sacred oaks within the circle, raising carved idols to the sky. The grad was both sword and plough, shield and cradle. It was where the Wends remembered who they were and where they passed that memory on. Even as centuries passed and enemies grew stronger, the Grodi remained. Stone castles rose across Europe, Yet the Wends clung to their wooden circles. To outsiders this seemed backward, a refusal to join the march of progress. To the Wends it was survival made solid, a system proven by blood. A castle was for a lord, a grad was for a people. When a Wendish child looked at its walls, they did not see the pride of one ruler, but the sweat of every ancestor who cut the trees, hauled the earth, and set each post in place. And so the Grody stood, season after season, a line of wooden teeth biting into the horizon. To the invader they were barriers. To the people inside they were home. More than once they were the line between life and extinction. They were not beautiful in the way of cathedrals, not vast like palaces, but in their stubborn endurance they carried a kind of power no stone could match. For as long as a grad rose above the marsh, the Wends were not conquered. They were alive, waiting, watching, and ready. They did not kneel before the cross, nor did they bow to the hammer of Thor. Their world was older than either, rooted in the forests and seas that cradled their lives. To understand the Wends you must understand their gods, for those gods were not distant beings locked in heaven. They were present in the earth itself, in the mist rising from the rivers at dawn, in the howl of wolves on winter nights, in the crash of storms rolling across the Baltic. The Wends lived close to the soil, and their gods lived just as close to them. The greatest of these was Svantovit, lord of the fourfold face, worshipped by the Rani of Ruggan. His temple stood high on a headland that looked out over the sea, a wooden hall painted in bright colours, filled with banners, horns, and the scent of sacrifice. Inside, his idol towered above men, carved from oak, holding a horn of mead in one hand and a bow in the other. Each year that horn was filled with wine, and priests would look at how much remained after the days had passed. If the wine had gone down, the god promised good harvests and victory in war. If it remained untouched, doom was near. The people came in their thousands, bringing horses, cattle, and silver, all offered to the four-faced one who saw in every direction. But Svantovit was not the only god of the Wends. Every tribe had its own divine guardians, spirits as varied as the forests they lived in. Radgast was worshipped at Radagosk, a black god of war and hospitality alike, said to favor guests even as he led warriors into battle. Triglov, the three-headed, watched from Volyn, each face turned to sky, earth, and underworld, uniting the realms that men walked through and feared. Jeravit carried the force of spring and youth, the heat of the sun returning after winter, and his festivals were wild with dancing, singing, and fire leaping into the night. Some gods were grim, keepers of fate and death. Others were gentle, protectors of fields, rivers, and herds. Together they formed a pantheon as fluid and living as the people themselves. The Saxons and Danes who encountered these shrines called them idols and mocked them, yet they never denied their power. Missionaries wrote with horror of temples decorated with crimson cloth, of sacrifices where horses' heads were hung from poles, of priests who rode the sacred stallions and claimed to read the future from their steps. They feared the way whole communities moved together in worship, how thousands might gather at one shrine, not out of obedience to kings, but from a shared faith that tied them tighter than any law. For the Wends, the gods were not abstract. They were family, woven into every season, every harvest, every battle. Worship was not confined to temples. Sacred groves were everywhere, dark circles of oak where no axe was allowed to bite, where people whispered prayers and left offerings of bread, milk, or honey. Springs bubbled with sanctity, lakes shimmered with unseen presence, stones carved with strange signs stood at the edges of fields. When a hunter took his bow into the woods, he spoke to the spirit of the forest. When a farmer scattered seed, he gave thanks to the Earth Mother. Life was full of small rituals, gestures that acknowledged the unseen. Even a meal at the hearth was not begun without raising a cup to the spirits who watched over home and kin. The gods were also bound to war. Before raiding or defending, warriors gathered at the shrine, seeking omens. A sacred horse might be led through a field of spears, and if it stepped with its right foot first, the god promised victory. If it stumbled, the raid might be abandoned. Weapons were consecrated, banners dipped in holy fire, and sacrifices made so that blood spilled in battle would not be wasted. The gods were not gentle overseers. They demanded loyalty and rewarded courage, punishing cowardice and neglect with famine or defeat. The Wends faith gave them strength against invaders. When the Saxons tried to baptize them by force, whole villages rose in rebellion, tearing down churches and slaughtering priests. To abandon their gods was to abandon the soil itself, the bond that held their tribes together. The temples and groves were more than places of worship. They were symbols of freedom. Every attack on them was felt as an attack on the people. When shrines were burned, they rebuilt them. When idols were smashed, they carved new ones, often larger and more imposing than before. Faith was defiance, and defiance was survival. Travelers who came from far-off lands were struck by the vividness of this world. Arab merchants wrote of markets filled with priests in white robes, leading processions of chanting worshippers. Scandinavian skalds told of strange rituals they half feared and half envied, of gods who demanded as much as Odin or Thor, yet seemed closer to the touch. Even Christian chroniclers, who despised pagan rites, admitted grudgingly that the Wends' devotion was fierce and unyielding. They saw in it the reason why conquest came so slowly, why the tribes clung to their independence long after others had been brought under the sword or the cross. What made their gods so powerful was not grandeur but intimacy. These deities lived with the Wends in their daily world, walked with them in the fields, hunted with them in the woods, fought beside them in battle. They were not locked in distant myths. They were present, immediate, demanding, and alive. To abandon them would have been to step into a void. And so the Wends held fast, guarding their temples as fiercely as their fortresses, believing that as long as their gods stood, so too would their people. Even as time wore on and kingdoms pressed harder from every side, even as fire and sword tore through their lands, the memory of those gods lingered. 4 centuries after their idols were cut down and their groves destroyed, stories of Svantovit and Triglov were whispered in the countryside, half-hidden prayers still carried to springs and stones. Their faith did not vanish. It sank deeper, like roots in dark soil, holding the people together long after outsiders believed it gone. The Baltic was never a quiet sea. Its waters, dark and cold, carried ships from every shore, and on those ships came goods, people, and stories that bound the region into a restless web. For the Wends this sea was not only a boundary, but a highway. Their rivers flowed into it, their villages leaned toward it, and their lives were shaped by what arrived on its waves. The same water that carried silver and salt also carried swords and fire. To live on its edge was to know that fortune and disaster both rode the same tide. From their harbors and river mouths, Wendish boats pushed outward. These were not the sleek dragon ships of the Norse, built for open seas and swift raids, but heavier vessels, broad of beam, made for carrying goods as much as men. They hugged the coasts, slipped from one bay to the next, and brought with them furs, amber, wax, honey, and slaves. Amber, above all, was treasured. Pulled from the sand after storms, polished to a golden sheen, it was carried from Wendish shores to far-off markets where it was traded like jewels. Merchants from the south came to buy it, their caravans stretching across Europe, eager for what the Wends could provide. The markets that grew along the coast were unlike the small gatherings of inland villages. Places like Volyn and Rerik became hubs where tongues from half of Europe could be heard in a single day. Franks with their silver coins bargained beside Danes offering iron and cloth. Slavic traders brought grain and timber, while men from distant lands carried glass, spices, and wine. To walk through one of these markets was to see the world compressed, each stall a window to somewhere else. The smell of smoked fish mixed with incense, the sound of haggling rose above the din, and the jangle of foreign coins struck against the hum of native speech. But trade was only one side of the sea. The other was violence. The Wends were no strangers to raiding. They learned quickly from their northern neighbors that wealth was not only earned but taken. Their ships carried warriors as often as merchants, and those warriors grew feared along the coasts of Denmark and Saxony. Villages burned, monasteries were stripped of treasures, captives were dragged away in chains. It was a brutal trade, yet it was as old as the sea itself, and the Wends, hemmed in by enemies on every side, gave as good as they received. The Vikings themselves did not find easy prey among them. When longships glided into Wendish bays, they met resistance not only from Grody on land, but from Wendish ships waiting at river mouths. The battles that broke out on the water were savage affairs, oars clashing as boats rammed each other, arrows whistling, men leaping from one deck to another with axes flashing. Sometimes it ended with a ship seized, its crew bound and dragged to market. Other times it ended with wrecks drifting ashore, their cargo scattered like bones on the sand. The sea did not favor one side forever, and fortunes turned with the wind. These struggles did not mean there was no cooperation. The Baltic was too important for that. At times Wends and Norsemen struck bargains, joining forces to raid richer shores farther west. They sailed together into the Elbe, even up to the Frisian coast, bringing fire and plunder where it had not been expected. The line between ally and enemy shifted with each season, for on the Baltic trust was never more than temporary. Today's trading partner might be tomorrow's raider, and every man knew it. This constant shifting bred a sharpness, a readiness to strike or defend at a moment's notice. The wealth that came through these ventures changed Wendish life. Silver coins from the Frankish mints piled up in their markets, foreign cloth draped their leaders, and weapons forged far away found their way into the hands of their warriors. Yet wealth always brought attention, and attention brought danger. Saxon lords looked at Wendish harbours and saw rivals. Danish kings eyed their markets and saw prizes worth seizing. The more the Wends traded, the more they fought to keep what was theirs. Still, the sea gave them something beyond goods and raids. It gave them connection. A Wend standing in a market at Volyn might handle a piece of silk that had come all the way from Byzantium, or hear a story told by a trader from the far Volga. Such things expanded the horizon of even those who never left their village. The Baltic was a stage on which they played their part, sometimes as merchants, sometimes as pirates, always as a people who could not be ignored. The rhythm of life along the coast was shaped by this dual role. Spring and summer saw the busiest sailing, when the sea was clear of ice and the winds were kind. Boats left laden with grain and hides, returned with salt and iron, and sometimes came back heavier with captives than with cargo. Autumn brought the harvest and preparations for winter, when the sea grew cruel and storms tore at ships with no mercy. Yet even in those months the markets did not fully sleep. Traders still came, if fewer, and the Grody on the rivers guarded what they had gained. What made the Wends distinct was not that they traded or raided, but how fiercely they defended their right to do both. The Baltic was crowded with rivals, yet the Wends carved out their space through persistence and resilience. They were not the richest merchants, nor the most famous sailors, but they endured where others were broken. Their markets flourished despite wars, their ships kept sailing despite losses, and their reputation grew until even kings hesitated before striking them. To look at the Wends on the Baltic is to see a people who balanced on a knife's edge, making survival itself into a kind of victory. They could be merchants one day, raiders the next, and defenders of their homes the day after. In a world where the sea gave and the sea took, they adapted without apology. They were never just victims of Viking raids, nor merely imitators of Norse trade. They were their own force, shaped by the tides, hardened by the struggle, and bound to the restless waters that lapped their shores. The Danes looked across the water and saw both threat and temptation. On the far shore lay Wendish lands, dotted with fortresses, markets, and harbours that pulsed with wealth. For the kings of Denmark, proud and ambitious, this was not a neighbour to ignore. The Baltic was too narrow, too restless, for two powers to grow side by side without striking sparks. Sooner or later, sparks became flames. The Danes had long been masters of the sea. Their longships skimmed across waves like hawks gliding after prey. Their warriors were feared from the coasts of England to the rivers of Francia. Yet here, just across the straits, lived a people who would not bend to their power. At times the Danes came to trade, but more often they came with fire. They struck at markets, seized ships, and demanded tribute. For the Wends, this was a challenge that could not be ignored. Submission would have meant the end of their freedom, and freedom was something they valued above life itself. The first clashes were sudden raids, the kind that tested strength and nerve. Danish longships swept into Wendish bays, hoping to catch villages unprepared, but they often found the Grody rising against them, wooden walls bristling with defenders. Arrows rained down from towers, and when the Danes tried to storm the gates, they met spears and stones. Sometimes the Danes prevailed, carrying off captives and spoils, but other times they were forced back to their ships, bloodied and enraged. The Wends were not easy prey, and every raid taught both sides that this was not a contest to be settled quickly. As years passed, raids grew into wars. Danish kings dreamed of controlling Wendish harbours, of turning their markets into tributary ports that would feed wealth into Danish coffers. To achieve this, they launched larger expeditions, fleets of ships carrying warriors by the hundred. They burned villages, tore down shrines, and demanded that Wendish chieftains bow before them. Yet each conquest was fragile, for the Wends fought like fire in dry grass. Once the Danes withdrew, the flames rose again. Fortresses were rebuilt, idols recarved, and warriors gathered for revenge. The clash between the two peoples was not just about land or loot. It was about pride, faith, and survival. The Danes carried with them the growing shadow of Christianity, often supported by missionaries and bishops eager to bring the cross to pagan shores. To the Wends, this was not simply an attack on their bodies, but on their very soul. They defended their gods with the same fury they defended their homes. Every shrine destroyed was avenged, every insult repaid. When Danish churches were planted on Wendish soil, they were torn down in the night, their priests slain or driven into the sea. There were moments when peace seemed possible. Treaties were signed, hostages exchanged, and marriages arranged to bind leaders across the water. But these truces rarely lasted. The Danes sought dominance, and the Wends would not submit. Distrust ran too deep, and ambition burned too bright. Soon enough, peace broke apart, and ships once again filled the straits, carrying men who came not to trade but to kill. The battles that erupted were not only on land, but also on the water. The Baltic itself became a battlefield, where fleets collided in storms of arrows and boarding fights. Wendish ships, though not as fast as the Danish longships, carried more men, and their warriors fought with ferocity. When they captured Danish vessels, they did not hesitate to use them, turning their enemies' tools against them. Each victory at sea was more than a triumph of arms. It was proof that the Wends could meet the masters of the waves on equal terms. The Danes, for their part, grew ever more determined. Kings like Harald Bluetooth and later Canute the Great sought to expand their rule over all who touched the Baltic. They believed themselves chosen to lead not only by might but by faith, carrying the banner of the cross against stubborn pagans. Yet the Wends shattered their confidence more than once. Danish fleets were wrecked on Wendish coasts, their warriors cut down in ambushes, their power challenged at every turn. What was meant to be conquest often turned into stalemate, with neither side able to crush the other completely. For the Wends, every clash with the Danes was both a test and a lesson. They learned to harden their defences, to rebuild swiftly after devastation, and to strike unexpectedly when their enemies least expected it. They did not have the same resources as the Danish kings, but they had resilience, and that proved just as powerful. Time and again they showed that while the Danes could raid, they could not rule. Still, the cost was heavy. Villages burned, fields lay wasted, and countless lives were lost. The Baltic that had once promised wealth and opportunity now seemed to carry only war. Yet even in the face of this, the Wends did not bend. Their leaders rallied their people, their priests called on the gods, and their warriors sharpened their blades. They understood that their survival depended not on peace with the Danes, but on standing against them. The clash between the Wends and the Danes would stretch across generations, shaping the destiny of both. For the Danes, it was a struggle to impose power beyond their own shores. For the Wends, it was the defense of everything they held dear. And though the Danes would one day carve their name across half of Europe, it was on the Wendish coast that they met their fiercest resistance, a people who fought them not once or twice, but endlessly, until the balance of the Baltic itself began to shift. Across the forests and marshes of Wendland rose shapes that told every traveller and raider they were entering a land that did not bend easily. These were the Grodi, the wooden strongholds of the Slavs, built on hills, islands, or narrow spits of land where water and earth combined to form natural shields. From a distance they looked like great crowns of timber rising above the trees, walls darkened by smoke and weather, towers jutting high with watchful eyes. They were not stone castles like those that would later spread across Europe, but living fortresses, made of the very earth and forest the Wends drew life from. And though they were built of wood, they could resist iron and fire long enough to break the strength of many foes. To understand the Wends' survival, one must understand these Grodi. Each was a world in itself, with ramparts rising in circles or squares, moats carved deep, and gates reinforced with layers of oak beams thick enough to stop an axe. Inside, houses pressed close together, streets narrow and winding, a jumble of dwellings, workshops, and storehouses. At the center stood temples or sacred enclosures where the gods were honored, where sacrifices were made to ensure the fortress stood firm. Life inside was crowded, noisy, but secure. In times of peace, the Grad was a bustling hub of trade, craft, and ritual. In times of war, it became a refuge, swallowing whole villages within its walls. When raiders came, horns sounded across the fields. Farmers abandoned their plows, women gathered children, and herds were driven into safety. Gates shut with thunderous force, bridges were drawn up, and the Grad became a clenched fist. From the walls, defenders hurled stones, loosed arrows, and poured boiling water onto attackers who dared approach. Siege engines of the Danes or Saxons sometimes battered the gates, but even when the walls cracked, the defenders fought like wolves. To storm a Grad was to step into a trap where every alley became a battlefield, every doorway a nest of resistance. Many invaders found that what looked like a quick conquest became a drawn-out agony. The Wends knew their lands were tempting to powerful neighbors, so they multiplied their fortresses. Along rivers, at lake crossings, near the Baltic shore, the Grodi stood like teeth in a great jaw. Each was not just a place of defense, but also a symbol of unity. Within its walls, clans came together under the authority of a chieftain or a council of elders. Disputes were judged, alliances sworn, and festivals held in honor of gods and ancestors. To belong to a grad was to belong to a living community that could not be easily broken. Among the most famous was Arkona, on the island of Rügen, where the great temple of the god Svantovit stood. Its fortress rose sheer above the sea, walls encircling sacred ground, and its defenders were said to be the bravest of all. To approach Arkona was to know you faced not just warriors, but a people who believed the gods themselves guarded their walls. Many stories grew of invaders driven back, ships wrecked against cliffs, and sacrifices that filled the night with fire and chanting. Arkona became a beacon of resistance, proof that wooden walls and burning faith could hold back even the mightiest kings. What made the Grodi remarkable was not only their strength but their flexibility. They were rebuilt as often as they were destroyed. When flames consumed them, new walls rose from the ashes. When enemies tore them down, the Wends raised them higher. The forests gave endless timber, the rivers gave clay for earthworks, and the people gave their hands. This rhythm of destruction and renewal made Wendish fortresses into something more than structures. They were symbols of resilience, a promise that even in defeat the people would rise again. For their enemies, the Grodi were nightmares. Danish raiders might burn a village in a day, but to take a grad could cost weeks of siege and countless lives. Saxon lords could march with armored knights, but those knights were useless against steep walls and muddy moats. Even when a fortress fell, the victory was hollow, for it left behind only ruins while another grad stood ready somewhere else. This endless cycle wore down invaders, teaching them that Wendish land could not be held easily, no matter how often it was crossed with fire and sword. Inside, life was hard but bound by pride. Families lived in cramped wooden homes, smoke curling from low chimneys, food stored in pits against the hunger of winter. Yet the people felt safe within their walls. Children played in courtyards, women wove cloth and brewed ale, craftsmen hammered iron and carved wood, and priests tended sacred fires. Every act, from the smallest chore to the grandest festival, was tied to the fortress itself. It was both shield and hearth, prison and home, a place where lives were defended and defined. The Grodi gave the Wends something more than protection. They gave them identity. To stand on the walls and look out across forest and field was to know that here, within these circles of wood and earth, a people had carved out their own space against the world. They might be outnumbered, outgunned, or outflanked, but behind their walls they had the strength to resist. These fortresses were not just timber and clay. They were memory, faith, and determination shaped into form. Even centuries later, when stone castles had spread across Europe and the Grodi were no more, the memory of them lingered. Chroniclers wrote of their stubborn strength, of how long they defied kings and armies, of how the Wends built and rebuilt until the very idea of conquest seemed impossible. The legacy of the Grodi was not in their survival as structures, but in the survival of the people who raised them. They taught the world that power was not always measured in gold or in iron, but in the will of a people to defend their homes with walls of wood and fire. For the Wends, the world was alive with gods who walked with them in the fields, on the seas, and in the forests that stretched endlessly across their homeland. These gods were not distant rulers in the sky, but neighbors who shared in the struggles of life and demanded loyalty in return. The Wends called upon them not only in battle, but also in planting, hunting, trade, and love. Their pantheon was vast and varied, yet at its heart stood a few mighty figures whose names carried power from the Baltic to the rivers of the east. Chief among these was Svantovit, the four-headed god of war, harvest, and prophecy. At Arkona, his temple stood as the greatest shrine of the Wendish people. His statue towered inside, carved from sacred wood, each of his faces looking in a different direction, seeing all that happened in the world. In one hand he held a drinking horn that priests filled each year with new wine, and from the level of the liquid they read the fate of the coming season. In another hand he carried a sword, proof that he was not only a god of bounty but also of blood. To the Wends, Svantovit was the guardian of their strength, the one who decided their victories and their harvests alike. To stand before his idol was to stand before destiny itself. But he was not alone. Rujivit, the warlord of the gods, bore many faces and many swords, his body bristling with weapons. He was the fury of warriors, the voice in the heart that demanded courage when fear pressed down. Priests of Rujivit called men to arms, promising his blessing if they fought with valor. There was also Poravit, a god of growth and fertility, whose worshippers sought blessings for their fields and families. Alongside him stood Pornut, whose twin aspects reminded the Wends of balance in life, a god who carried both sternness and kindness in his image. Each god filled a need, and together they formed a tapestry that reflected the many sides of Wendish life. The Wends did not worship their gods in silence. Their temples rang with chants, drums, and horns. Processions wound through the Grody, with banners flying and sacrifices prepared. Animals were led before the idols, their blood spilled to honor the gods and renew the bond between people and divine. Sometimes, when times were desperate, human lives were given too. Captives taken in raids were sacrificed to ensure victory in war or good fortune in the harvest. To modern minds this may seem grim, but to the Wends it was part of the natural order. Life was given and taken, and through sacrifice the cycle was kept whole. Priests stood at the center of this world, their authority vast. They interpreted omens, guided rituals, and held power over kings and chieftains. A ruler could command warriors, but only the priests could tell him if the gods favored his cause. Without their blessing, no campaign began, no treaty was signed, no harvest celebrated. They carried the weight of prophecy, reading signs in the flight of birds, the patterns of fire, and the words of dreams. In this way, faith and politics were bound so tightly together that neither could be separated from the other. The gods were not only protectors, but also companions. In the quiet of the fields, farmers whispered prayers to the earth as they sowed seeds, asking for gentle rains and strong growth. Fishermen called upon sea gods before venturing into dangerous waters, promising offerings in return for a safe voyage. Mothers prayed for healthy children, warriors for strong arms, merchants for luck on the road. The gods were everywhere, and the Wends carried them in their thoughts as easily as they carried tools or weapons. Festivals tied the people to their deities with joy as much as fear. In spring, celebrations marked the return of life, with songs, dances, and feasts that lasted days. In autumn, harvest festivals gave thanks to Svantovit and Poravit, with wagons overflowing with grain and fruit brought into temples as offerings. At midsummer, fires were lit on hilltops and coastlines, flames rising high into the night sky as symbols of the gods' eternal power. These festivals were not solemn events alone, but moments when the community gathered, when joy, laughter, and song mixed with reverence and sacrifice. In them, the Wends found not only faith, but also unity. The gods shaped the way the Wends saw themselves in their endless struggle with neighbors like the Danes and Saxons. Each victory was a gift from Svantovit, each defeat a warning that the people had failed in devotion or courage. To be Wendish was not just to fight or to farm, but to live as part of a sacred pact with the divine. Even their enemies knew of this fierce devotion. Chroniclers from Christian lands wrote with awe and fear of the great temples, of the priests who wielded more authority than kings, of the sacrifices that bound the people together with terrifying certainty. When Christian missionaries came, they did not only face warriors with swords. They faced an entire system of belief, that touched every corner of life. To destroy the Wends' power meant destroying their gods, and this proved harder than any battle. Churches could be burned, priests could be slain, but as long as the temple stood, the people stood with them. Arkona, Rethra, and other sanctuaries were more than holy places. They were the hearts of Wendish identity. To attack them was to attack the soul of a people, and so they were defended with the last measure of strength. The gods of war and harvest did more than command worship. They gave meaning to endurance. In a world of shifting powers, of raids and invasions, the Wends turned to their deities as anchors. Faith gave them courage to resist, and resistance gave them faith that their gods had not abandoned them. Even centuries later, when Christian conquest finally swept away the temples, the echoes of these gods remained in stories, in place names, and in the stubborn pride of the descendants who remembered a time when the gods walked among them. The Wends lived in a land of marshes, rivers, forests, and coasts, and though much of their reputation came from the battles they fought, another part of their story lay in the way they dealt with neighbors in times when blades were sheathed. Between their fortresses and villages stretched long trade routes that carried furs, amber, wax, and honey from the depths of their forests out to the markets of the Baltic and beyond. From the north came silver and weapons, from the south cloth and wine, from the east salt and spices carried along great rivers. To live among the Wends was to live at the crossroads of desire, where merchants carried stories as much as goods, and every bargain was as much a gamble as any raid. Their markets were loud and crowded, with stalls set up along river banks or in the shadow of a grod's walls. Farmers came with grain, hunters with skins of fox, bear, and beaver, and fishermen with barrels of herring and eels. In exchange they sought tools, trinkets, and coins that bound them to a wider world. Sometimes the merchants were Wendish themselves, bold enough to travel far into Danish harbours or Saxon towns, where their language marked them as outsiders, but their goods gave them welcome. At other times foreign traders braved Wendish waters, drawn by the promise of amber and furs, though they came with as much fear as greed, for they knew that the line between a trading visit and a raid was often thin. Silver flowed through these exchanges like blood in veins. The Wends did not mint coins of their own, but collected and hoarded them in staggering amounts. Silver dirhams from the east, deniers from the Franks, and pennies from the Anglo-Saxons all passed through Wendish hands. Some were cut into pieces and weighed as bullion, others were kept whole as tokens of wealth. Silver bought alliances, paid mercenaries, and lined the temples where gods were honored with glittering offerings. To a Wendish chieftain, wealth was not measured in land alone, but in the weight of metal he could show before his warriors. But trade was never safe, and it was never simple. A ship heavy with goods could be plundered before reaching its harbor, its crew slaughtered or sold as slaves. A merchant could be welcomed into a grod one season and slain at its gates the next if suspicion turned against him. Trust was fragile, and oaths of peace were tested often. The Wends knew this well, and sometimes they used trade as a lure, allowing outsiders to believe in safety before seizing their cargo at sword's point. To their enemies, this was treachery. To the Wends, it was simply survival, a way to turn opportunity into power. Tribute was another kind of trade, one carried out under the shadow of force. The Danes, when their fleets were strong, demanded yearly tribute from Wendish chieftains, collecting silver, cattle, and even slaves to feed their king's ambitions. Saxon lords tried the same, sending envoys with threats of fire and steel if payments were not delivered. Yet just as often it was the Wends themselves who demanded tribute from weaker neighbors, their raiders appearing in the night to remind villagers of the cost of defiance. Tribute was not always a permanent mark of submission. It could shift with fortune. When Wendish arms were strong, the flow of wealth came to them. When they were weakened, it flowed out again. In this dance of power, treasure changed hands as often as blood was spilled. The greatest treacheries came not from markets or raiders, but from kings and rulers who cloaked ambition in the language of alliance. Danish princes sometimes offered marriage ties with Wendish chieftains, only to betray them when power tipped in their favor. Saxon bishops promised peace if temples were destroyed, then sent armies once the idols fell. Even among the Wends themselves, alliances were fragile. One grad might betray another, throwing open its gates to a foreign king in hope of protection. Treachery could be born out of desperation as much as greed, and in a land constantly pressed by enemies, desperation was never far away. Yet treachery did not always mean defeat. Sometimes the Wends turned it back upon those who sought to trick them. Envoys would come to collect tribute only to be seized and ransomed. Foreign armies, invited in by one Wendish ruler, might find themselves surrounded by allies who turned coats at the right moment. Tales spread of feasts where agreements were sealed with drink, only for poison to slip into cups, or of ambushes sprung on roads once thought safe. The line between loyalty and betrayal was thin, and the Wends knew how to walk it with cunning as sharp as their swords. Through all this, trade remained the lifeblood that tied them to a wider world. Without it, they would have been a people hidden in forests, known only to neighbors. With it, they became part of the great web of the North, feared and respected not only for their ferocity in war, but also for the riches they commanded. Their amber gleamed in foreign crowns, their furs warmed distant courts, and their silver piled high in temples that echoed with chants to gods who demanded both blood and wealth. The Wends lived in a world where every choice was a risk, every agreement a potential snare. To trade was to open the door to treachery, and to pay tribute was to admit weakness, yet both were necessary to survive between empires and kingdoms greater in number and resources. They managed it not by trust but by balance, always ready to shift between peace and war, bargain and blade. It was this ability, as much as their fortresses or their gods, that allowed them to hold their place in the Baltic world for centuries, defying those who thought to break them with silver, fire, or lies. The greatest struggle of the Wends was not with Viking fleets or Saxon swords, but with a faith that came across borders and seas with the certainty of destiny. Christianity pressed in on them from every side, carried by missionaries who spoke of peace but walked in the shadow of kings and bishops who hungered for conquest. The clash was not only of armies but of worlds. For the Wends, their gods stood close and familiar, protectors of fields and fortresses, but to the Christians they were demons to be cast down. Where the Wends saw temples as the beating heart of their people, the Christians saw strongholds of darkness that had to be broken for salvation to triumph. The first missionaries came with words rather than weapons. They traveled from Saxon bishoprics, speaking of a single God who ruled heaven and earth, who promised eternal life beyond the grave. They carried crosses and books, strange objects in Wendish lands, and tried to plant their faith with sermons instead of swords. Sometimes a chieftain would listen, curious about new rituals, perhaps even allowing a church to rise beside a grad. But more often these strangers were driven away, mocked, or even slain. To abandon the gods of the ancestors was no light thing. It meant betraying the spirits that had given victories, guided harvests, and kept the people alive through centuries of danger. Yet the missionaries did not come alone. Behind them stood Saxon dukes, Danish kings, and emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. The cross was followed by armies, and the word of salvation by the clang of iron. Conversion was not only about belief, but about control. To turn a Wendish ruler into a Christian was to bind him into the orbit of the empire, to make him an ally of the church and a vassal of foreign lords. Many rulers saw this clearly and resisted, for they knew that once the idols fell and the churches stood in their place, the independence of the Wends would be forever weakened. Temples became the first targets of this holy war. At Rethra, Arkona, and other sacred places, Christian chroniclers wrote of great idols smashed and altars overturned, The gods toppled into the dirt as monks raised crosses over their ruins. But such victories rarely came easily. Every temple was a fortress as much as a sanctuary, guarded by warriors who fought to the death to defend their gods. The fall of a shrine was more than a defeat in battle. It was the shattering of identity, a blow aimed at the soul of a people. No wonder that even when Christian armies triumphed, the land would rise in rebellion soon after, as the Wends tried again to restore what was taken from them. For the Christians, these wars were crusades before the word became famous. Preachers urged knights to take up arms against the pagans, promising forgiveness of sins and eternal reward for those who fought. To them, the Wends were not only enemies of kings but enemies of God himself, and in that judgment there could be no compromise. The raids of Viking ships or the demands of tribute were things one might negotiate, but with the cross came absolutes. The choice was clear: submit and be baptized, or resist and be destroyed. The Wends answered with fire. They struck Christian churches that tried to take root in their lands, burning them to the ground and slaying priests before altars. They raided deep into Saxony, carrying war not only as vengeance, but as a warning that their gods still stood strong. They ambushed armies sent to convert them, using forests and marshes as allies, turning terrain into a weapon that even the most heavily armed knights could not easily overcome. Time and again they proved that their spirit was not easily bent, even when faced with the weight of empires. But Christianity also had its weapons of patience and persistence. Some rulers, tempted by the wealth and prestige that came with alliance to kings and bishops, allowed themselves to be baptized. Their warriors might have grumbled, their priests might have raged, but political need often spoke louder than tradition. The cycle repeated many times. A ruler accepted the cross, his people were told to follow, rebellion broke out, and the gods once again rose in the name of the old gods. It was a slow struggle, a grinding clash of faiths where neither side yielded easily, and for centuries the border between pagan and Christian wavered back and forth like a tide. The clash with the cross was not only about altars and temples, but about identity itself. The Christians offered a universal faith, one meant to erase differences of tribe and tongue beneath a single banner. The Wends held to their local gods, their sacred places, and their own ways of life. In this difference lay the sharpest edge of the conflict. To become Christian was to step into a world where old names and rituals were branded as evil, where ancestors were condemned as lost souls, and where loyalty to priests and bishops replaced loyalty to the gods of the land. Many Wends could not bear this, for it felt like the erasure of everything that had ever defined them. And yet the pressure never stopped. Each generation saw more missions, more armies, more crosses raised over ruins. The clash was not a single war, but a long chain of wars, rebellions, truces, and betrayals that stretched across centuries. It scarred the land and scarred the memory of the people. For the Wends, every victory over a missionary or crusader was a defiance of a world that sought to erase them. For their enemies, every victory over a temple or grod was proof that God's will was unfolding. Between them, the rivers ran red, and the forests echoed with cries of both triumph and despair. In the end, this was the battle that defined the Wendish world. To resist the cross was to cling to freedom, but it was also to invite endless war. To accept it was to gain peace at the price of surrendering the soul of the people. This choice, forced upon them again and again, broke kings, shattered alliances, and shaped their fate more deeply than any raid or tribute ever could. The clash with the cross was not only the story of a people fighting to keep their gods, but of a world colliding with change so vast that no sword could turn it aside forever. The Wends fought in a world where battles were not mere contests of soldiers, but storms that decided the fate of whole peoples. To fight was not only to defend land or honor, but to keep alive the spirit of independence that pulsed through their villages and grods. Each clash with Vikings, Saxons, or crusaders was written in blood and fire, and each left behind scars that lived long after the last corpse had been carried from the field. Their wars were fierce and desperate, born out of the knowledge that they stood surrounded by powers greater in wealth, arms, and numbers, yet unwilling to bow. When the Wends took the field, they fought as men bound together by kinship and oath, not as professional armies drilled into formation. A chieftain or priest might call the warriors to gather, and the summons was answered by farmers, hunters, and fishermen who set aside their work to take up axe and spear. They came in small bands, each bound by ties of blood and trust, and together these bands formed a host that burned with loyalty to their gods and their homeland. They did not fight in perfect lines, but with the fury of men defending their very existence, rushing forward with shields locked and voices raised in chants that carried across the battlefield like thunder. Their weapons were simple but deadly. Spears thrust in tight formation, axes swung with crushing force, and bows loosed from behind wooden shields cut down enemies before they could close. Swords, costly and rare, were often carried by leaders or champions who stood as symbols of strength. Armor was scarce, though some warriors wore coats of mail taken from fallen enemies, and others trusted only in leather and wood. Yet if their equipment seemed humble, their spirit was not. They used the land as a weapon, striking from forests, marshes, and riverbanks where heavy cavalry faltered and armored men drowned in mud. Every hill, every grove, every stream could become a trap when Wendish warriors lay in wait. The Vikings had once thought themselves unmatched on the seas, but when they ventured into Wendish waters, they often found themselves facing foes who fought with equal cunning. Wends used light ships that could slip along rivers and strike suddenly at coastal towns, then vanish before pursuit. At sea they did not always meet the Vikings ship for ship, but chose their moments carefully, striking when the enemy was vulnerable. When a Viking camp was left unguarded or a fleet anchored carelessly, Wendish raiders would descend with firebrands, burning ships to the waterline and scattering their enemies into the waves. The sea, like the land, could be turned into a weapon in the hands of those who knew its secrets. On land, the great battles often began with raids that swelled into wars. A village burned, a temple desecrated, a tribute demanded. Such sparks ignited fires that spread across whole regions. Armies gathered, alliances formed, and fields became graveyards. Saxon knights charged with lances lowered, their banners bright against the smoke of burning huts. Danish kings landed fleets, their warriors in iron pushing against wooden palisades. Against them the Wends stood, their shields splintering under blows, their bodies pressed together in stubborn defiance. They could not always match the enemy's numbers or weapons, but they answered with courage, with ambush, with sudden strikes that turned victory into chaos. One of the most feared sights in battle was the Wendish fury when defending their sacred places. Around Arkona or Rethra, warriors fought with a desperation that seemed beyond human strength. They believed their gods watched, that to falter was to betray not only their kin but the divine powers that guided their lives. Songs and prayers rose alongside the clash of steel, and the idols stood at the center of the storm, wrapped in smoke and the cries of dying men. Even when walls fell and fires consumed their temples, the Wends fought to the last, their resistance remembered in the fearful respect of their enemies. But battles were not only victories. Many times the Wends were broken, their warriors scattered and their villages left in ashes. The armies of kings and crusaders could not always be stopped, and their strength ground down even the fiercest defenders. Yet even in defeat, the Wends did not vanish. Survivors melted back into forests, rebuilt their grods, and raised their banners again. What was lost one year could be regained the next, and the cycle of war never ended. Their resilience was as much a weapon as any axe, for their enemies could win battles but rarely peace. The battles of blood and fire left behind more than corpses. They reshaped the land itself. Fields that had once fed villages became mass graves. Rivers ran red and carried the memory downstream. Villages rebuilt upon ruins bore the marks of fire in their very soil. Generations grew up with stories of fathers and grandfathers who had fallen, of betrayals and triumphs, of gods who demanded courage in the face of endless war. This memory was passed on in songs and stories, keeping alive the spirit of resistance even when the battles themselves faded into the haze of time. What made these wars so haunting was not only the scale of violence, but the meaning behind them. For the Wends, every clash was a stand for freedom, for the right to live under their own gods and customs. For their enemies, every clash was a step toward domination, whether in the name of kingship or the cross. The fields soaked with blood were not merely battlefields. They were the meeting place of two worlds that could not easily share the same space. Out of that meeting came destruction, but also a legacy of defiance that made the Wends remembered not just as victims of conquest, but as warriors who fought with unyielding spirit. The battles were many, the names of places countless, but together they told the same story, of a people who refused to yield quietly, who answered fire with fire and blood with blood. Each victory carried hope, each defeat carried pain, but in both the Wends proved that they were not a people to be erased without resistance. Their battles, though often tragic, carved their memory into the chronicles of their foes, so that even in the pages of their enemies' histories, their courage could not be forgotten. The story of the Wends was never marked by a single crushing blow, a day when all was lost and silence fell forever. Instead, their decline stretched across generations, a slow unraveling of power and independence that wore them down piece by piece. Their fall was not a collapse, but an erosion, the way cliffs yield to waves or forests to axes. Each raid they endured, each treaty they signed, each defeat they suffered chipped away at their strength, until the fierce warriors who had once terrified the coasts of the Baltic found themselves pressed into corners, hemmed in by kings, crusaders, and priests who did not stop until Wendish defiance was swallowed by a new order. At first, the signs of weakness were not obvious. The Wends still built strongholds, still launched raids, and still fought with the same determination that had carried them through centuries of struggle. Yet around them the world was changing. The Viking age that had once given them both allies and enemies was fading, its great fleets broken or bound to Christian kings. To the west, Saxon lords strengthened their grip with stone castles and heavily armed knights. To the north, Denmark and Norway began to look less like scattered bands of raiders, and more like kingdoms bound under rulers who claimed divine favor through the cross. Where the Wends remained divided among many tribes and chieftains, their enemies were slowly learning unity, and unity gave them power. Christianity grew like a creeping vine through the lands surrounding Wendish territory. At first it was only in words, the sermons of priests who promised peace and salvation, but words became armies, and armies brought fire and steel. Churches rose on conquered ground, their bells calling people to a faith that denied the gods of the Wends. Each campaign that ended with a burning temple or toppled idol left the survivors weakened in spirit as much as in arms. The cross was more than a symbol of faith. It was a banner carried by kings and crusaders who claimed divine right to destroy all who resisted. The Wends, whose gods had long demanded blood and sacrifice, now faced a relentless faith that sought not compromise but total submission. Economics, too, turned against them. Where once their rivers and ports had thrived with trade, merchants now favored safer harbors guarded by kings who offered stability. Tribute drained their resources, and silver flowed out of their hands into the coffers of their conquerors. Without wealth to pay mercenaries or forge alliances, their ability to resist crumbled further. Villages that had once been proud centers of commerce shrank into shadows of themselves, their markets silent where once they had hummed with bargaining voices. The Wends still traded, but the balance was no longer in their favor, and with each passing decade they found themselves more dependent on the powers that sought their submission. perhaps the greatest wound was internal. For centuries, Wendish tribes had struggled to unite. When threatened, they might gather in large forces, but old rivalries and jealousies soon tore those alliances apart. One chieftain might strike peace with a Danish king while another sharpened his axe for war. One grad might throw open its gates to priests in search of protection, while another still clung to idols. Their enemies learned to exploit these divisions, playing tribe against tribe, offering rewards to one while punishing another. Treachery became as deadly as battle, and slowly the bonds of kinship that had once held them together frayed beyond repair. Despite this, the Wends did not vanish overnight. Their resistance burned brightest even as their fall drew near. There were uprisings, sudden bursts of rage that flared against their conquerors. Chieftains rose who tried to restore old strength, and battles were fought that carried echoes of their former power. Yet these victories, when they came, were fleeting. Each triumph was followed by greater retaliation. Each rebellion was crushed with more brutal force. Temples that had been rebuilt in secret were torn down again, and leaders who dared resist were executed, their deaths used as warnings to others. The will to fight remained, but the means to win dwindled. The fall of their sacred centers was the deepest cut. Arkona, with its towering temple to Svantovit, had been a beacon of Wendish faith and unity. When it fell to Danish forces, the flames that consumed it seemed to consume the heart of Wendish independence. Other sanctuaries followed, their idols toppled, their priests slain or driven into hiding. Without their gods to rally around, the Wends lost not just battles but the very foundation of their identity. What replaced it was a faith imposed from outside, enforced with sword and fire. To some it brought survival, to others humiliation, but to all it marked the end of an age. And yet, even as they yielded to these pressures, the Wends left behind traces that did not die with their fall. Their villages lived on, though under new lords. Their customs, though altered, seeped into the fabric of the lands they inhabited. Even their blood endured, mingling with those who conquered them, carried on in the faces of descendants who no longer called themselves Wends, but still bore the legacy of their ancestors. The slow fall of the Wends was not a vanishing into nothing but a transformation, one that erased their name from the maps yet left their spirit scattered across the Baltic world. The tragedy of their decline lay not in a single moment of destruction, but in the long fading of a people who had once stood proud and unyielding. Their power slipped away like sand through fingers, not because they lacked courage, but because the tide of history pushed against them with a force they could not resist forever. Surrounded by stronger kingdoms, pressed by a new faith, and divided among themselves, they were pulled into a world that had no place for their independence. Their story became one of memory rather than presence, whispered in chronicles that often came from the pens of their enemies, yet even in those pages the echoes of their defiance refused to be silenced. The Wends are gone as a people who called themselves by that name, yet they did not vanish into dust or silence. Their story lingers in ways both subtle and strong, a shadow across the Baltic world that never entirely faded. Their villages may have been conquered, their temples burned, and their gods cast down, but their memory refuses to disappear. To understand their legacy is to see how the spirit of a people can outlast the destruction of their independence, how culture and memory can survive even when names are erased from maps. In the lands where they once thrived, echoes of their presence remain woven into the soil itself. Place names still whisper their tongue, carved into rivers, forests, and towns that once belonged to them. Even as new rulers claimed authority and new languages took root, these names endured, stubborn markers that remind us who walked those paths first. The Wends may no longer raise their banners, but the geography of Central and Eastern Europe still carries the sound of their lives. These names are monuments more enduring than stone, left not by the victors, but by the people who lived and died in those places before history tried to bury them. Their blood, too, flowed into the veins of Europe. When kingdoms conquered the Wends, they did not erase them physically. The people were absorbed, intermarried, and lived on within the populations that followed. Today, the descendants of the Wends cannot be separated from the broader tapestry of Slavic and Germanic peoples, yet their existence is a hidden strand in that weave. Their legacy is not always in what can be clearly pointed to, but in what has become inseparable from the whole. The farmer tilling fields in what was once Pomerania, the merchant in Lubeck centuries later, the villager who kept an old tale alive without knowing its origin, all carried something of the Wends forward. There is also the matter of resistance, the lesson their story offers to history. The Wends were not the most powerful of peoples in their age, nor the most organized, yet they refused to surrender easily. For centuries they stood against Danes, Saxons, and Crusaders, fighting wars that outlasted kings and dynasties. Though they eventually fell, their resistance shaped the politics of the Baltic and delayed the domination of stronger neighbors. They were a thorn that forced greater powers to bleed, a reminder that conquest was never easy. Their stubbornness is their legacy as much as their culture. The spiritual imprint they left is harder to trace, but no less important. Though their temples were destroyed and their gods declared demons, the memory of their faith did not vanish at once. Old rituals lingered in secret, sometimes blending with Christian practices, sometimes surviving in folk customs passed down quietly. Bonfires, harvest festivals, or charms hung against misfortune carried traces of their pagan roots. What began as devotion to Svantovit or Purin became over time fragments of tradition no longer recognized for what they were, yet still alive in the rhythm of everyday life. In this way, the Wends gods survived not as statues in temples, but as whispers in the practices of their descendants. Their story also lingers in chronicles written by outsiders, often enemies who despised them. These accounts portray them as stubborn pagans, dangerous raiders, or savage resistors, yet even in such biased descriptions the Wends emerge as formidable and proud. They troubled kings, defied missionaries, and forced rulers to return again and again to their lands with armies. If the measure of a people's strength is how long they can make stronger neighbors fear them, then the Wends achieved a legacy worthy of memory. The fact that chroniclers felt the need to write of them at all proves they mattered. Their defiance left marks on history that even hostile pens could not erase. Modern scholars and archaeologists still unearth their story in fragments of pottery, weapons buried with warriors, and the charred remains of temples. Each discovery pulls back the veil a little more, giving voice to a people often silenced in written records. Their fortresses, when uncovered, reveal the scale of their determination and the skill with which they built. Their graves show us their customs, their jewelry their artistry, their idols their devotion. In these remains we can glimpse not only how they lived, but how they wished to be remembered. Even centuries after their defeat, the ground itself speaks of them. The legacy of the Wends also lies in the questions they leave behind. They challenge us to think about how history remembers the conquered. How many other peoples were erased, their names lost, their stories told only by enemies? How often do we take survival to mean victory, when sometimes survival means being absorbed? The Wends remind us that a people can vanish as a political force, yet endure in countless invisible ways. Their story complicates the neat narratives of kings and conquerors, showing us that history is not only written in triumphs, but also in the persistence of those who refused to vanish quietly. To speak of the Wends today is to speak of resilience, of a people who fought until they could fight no more, and who then lived on in other forms. They remind us that power is never permanent, that kingdoms rise and fall, but the spirit of resistance can echo for centuries. Their legacy is not in empires or monuments, but in memory, in the stubborn endurance of their culture, their defiance, and their blood carried forward into generations who never knew their name. The Wends may not have written their own histories, but their legacy insists on being remembered, for in their struggle lies a truth older than kingdoms. No people truly disappears so long as their story is told. The Wends did not leave behind great stone monuments like the Egyptians or sprawling chronicles like the Romans. They did not carve their victories into marble or preserve their rulers in grand epics. Instead, what they left was an echo, a sound that lingers long after the voice itself has gone. This echo hums beneath the history of the Baltic world, faint yet persistent, reminding us that even those who fall leave behind traces that endure in unexpected ways. The echo of the Wends is not heard in one place alone but across many layers: geography, folklore, memory, and the restless imagination of those who try to recover what was lost. For centuries, their name carried weight as both threat and memory. To their enemies, it became shorthand for defiance, for the stubborn refusal to bow even when surrounded by stronger powers. To priests and chroniclers, it was a warning of the dangers of pagan faith and the resilience of people who clung to it. To later generations, it became part of the shifting identity of Europe itself, folded into stories of how nations were forged out of conflict and conversion. The echo of the Wends is a murmur in all these tales, never loud enough to dominate but never silenced enough to vanish. What makes their echo powerful is that it speaks of those who did not control the pen. History is usually written by victors, by kings and priests who shape memory to their will. The Wends did not write their own story, yet somehow their presence still forces itself into the record. Their enemies cursed them, feared them, and celebrated their defeat, but in doing so they ensured that the Wends would never be entirely forgotten. Every account of a crusade against them, every mention of their raids, every description of their gods is an unwilling act of preservation. Their echo lives in the very words meant to bury them. Legends of the Wends lingered in folk tales told long after their temples fell. Farmers still lit fires at midsummer, sailors whispered of spirits in the Baltic waves, and villagers sang songs whose origins stretched further back than memory. These fragments of culture, often disguised as harmless traditions, carried pieces of their world forward. The echo of the Wends resided in laughter around village fires, in charms whispered against storms, in the stubborn survival of names that clung to rivers and forests. It was not the loud echo of conquest, but the soft echo of continuity, quiet yet lasting. In the broader scope of history, the Wends remind us of the fragile balance between survival and disappearance. They show us how a people can resist fiercely and still be absorbed, how defeat does not mean silence, and how legacy often works in ways no conqueror can predict. Their echo in history is a question asked again and again. What does it mean to be remembered? Is it the endurance of a name, or is it the survival of customs, language, and memory even when the name is gone? The Wends answer by existing in half-light, remembered and forgotten at once, both vanished and enduring. Their echo also warns of the cost of forgetting. When we lose the stories of peoples like the Wends, we lose not just the details of battles and leaders, but entire ways of seeing the world. Their gods, their songs, their courage, and their grief all carried wisdom, and though much has been erased, the little that remains reminds us of the richness that lies beneath the surface of recorded history. To hear their echo is to understand that history is full of voices that struggled to speak but were drowned out. To recover them is not just to honor the past, but to expand the story of humanity itself. The Wends also live on in the fascination they spark among those who seek them today. Scholars dig into the soil of their old strongholds, piecing together stories from shards of pottery and the foundations of walls. Historians trace their presence in chronicles, filling in the gaps with care. Even artists and writers find inspiration in their fate, drawn to the drama of a people who fought the mighty and left behind only fragments. Each of these efforts is an attempt to make the echo clearer, to give shape to what lingers in shadow. The Wends continue to inspire because their story speaks to something universal, the desire to endure against overwhelming odds, and the bittersweet truth that sometimes endurance takes forms no one expected. If the echo of the Wends tells us anything, it is that no people disappears entirely. Conquerors may claim victory, temples may fall, names may fade, but the human spirit has a way of lingering. It lingers in the land, in the blood of descendants, in stories retold, in the stubborn survival of traditions, in the records of enemies who thought they were burying the past but instead preserved it. The Wends' echo in history is proof that memory is never entirely at the mercy of power. Even the smallest voice can leave a resonance that centuries cannot erase. To listen for that echo is to remember that history is not only the story of the powerful. It is also the story of those who stood, resisted, and endured, even when the tide was against them. The Wends may not have left us chronicles or monuments, but they left us something perhaps more enduring. The lesson that no struggle is wasted, that even in defeat a people can shape the world around them, and that echoes can carry further than shouts. Their name may be a whisper now, but a whisper that has survived 1,000 years is stronger than silence.